Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the birth of the Roman Republic in our continuing study of the history of civilization. I'd like to look at the Mediterranean, and jutting out into the Mediterranean is the Italian peninsula. You know, the word Mediterranean actually means Middle Earth, and it gives you sort of a hint of what the Romans thought of that part of the world. They viewed themselves right at the center of everything. But that Italian peninsula, which juts out, it's centrally located in the Mediterranean, and it's surrounded, as a peninsula is, on three sides by water, and that's going to shape the Roman people. It's bordered on the north side by the Alps, and so it takes a bit to get to that Italian peninsula. You either have to get in a boat and go across the Mediterranean, or you have to cross the Alps, and that's going to give them a measure of isolation. But it's also going to give them some waterways that bring people to their shores. The Romans have a story. It's a song written much later in its history, but it reflects earlier traditions, called the Aeneid. And the Aeneid, fashioned after and actually sort of borrowing from a bit the Iliad and the Odyssey, begins, I sing of arms and a man, he who exiled by fate first came from the coast of Troy. Notice it's actually going back to the Trojan War, and we're going to look at that in a second. But somebody leaves Troy. He's Aeneas, who leaves Troy and travels to Italy, and to Lavinian shores hurled about endlessly by land and sea, by the will of the gods, by cruel Juno's remorseless anger, long suffering also in war, until he founded a city, and brought his gods to Latium, and from that the Latin people came, the lords of Alba Longa, the walls of noble Rome. This was a poem that reflects the origins of the city of Rome. The story begins way back at the fall of Troy. And remember, we talked about Troy and the Trojan horse and how the Greeks used this subterfuge to gain access to the city, and the Romans looked at their beginning as way back then, where one of their people was a member of the House of Troy. And as Troy had its fall, Aeneas, our hero, he flees the city with his father and his son. He's carrying his father on his back. He's holding his little son's hand, and he flees and makes his way in a similar way to where in the Odyssey, remember, Odysseus is going home. Well, Aeneas is looking for a new home, and he finds his way first all the way to Carthage, and there he meets Dido, the queen of the Carthaginians, and they fall in love, and they're happy, and Dido says, well, why don't you just settle here? And Aeneas says, no, I have to go find my own city. I have to found my own city. He has this idea that he's going to found the city of Rome. And so he comes eventually to Italy now, and he founds the Latin race. The city of Rome isn't there yet, but he begins the Latin people here in Italy. And if you ask them, where did you folks come from? They would tell the story, we came from Troy. And so here we are. Now we're in Italy, and the thing is, Italy already had other people in it. You had the Etrurians, what we call the Etruscans in Etruria. Of course, now the Latinium is going to settle there. The Latins are going to be there. To the south, they have the tribe of Campania. To the even further south, at the southern part of the boot of Italy, we have Greek colonies. And remember, you've got Greek colonies all throughout the Mediterranean at this point. And then to the north there are the Gauls. Now, we're going to see Gauls both on this side of the Alps and also Gauls on the other side of the Alps. But there's Gauls in northern Italy at this point in history. The beginning of Rome looks back, again, according to the Roman traditions, this is the stories that they tell, the founders of Rome were Romulus and Remus. Their father had his throne usurped their father was Numitor, and Amulius usurped the throne of his brother Numitor, and Numitor's surviving daughter had 2 sons. They're going to be Romulus and Remus. And the twin boys are set adrift on the Tiber River as a way of dispensing with them, as a way of putting them to death. That's a familiar theme in the ancient world. Remember how Moses, and in fact, the Pharaoh says, throw all the Israelites into the Nile River. And Moses is taken and set adrift on a basket, but in that case with a babysitter. Well, here there's no babysitter. The twin boys are put in some sort of basket and set adrift on the Tiber, which is going to take them out to the ocean where they're going to die. And instead, they're found and suckled by a wolf, and then they're found and raised by a farmer. And so they're delivered from this death to which they had been ordained. Once the brothers have grown to adulthood, they come back and they overcome their uncle and restore their father properly to his throne. But instead of settling to be the crown princes and perhaps eventually succeeding their father, no, they want to found a city of their own. And so they go forth and they're looking for a location, and they find this place by the Tiber River. This is going to be the location of the city. But which hill is it going to be on? And Remus says, well, I just saw this, a number of birds in the sky. It must be a sign that my place is going to be the right place. And Romulus says, well, no, I saw more birds. And so it's a sign that I'm going to be the leader of the city. And they're not quite sure. And Romulus, meanwhile, he starts building his wall around the city. Of course, it's not going to be a very big city at first, not a very big wall, but he's building this wall. And Remus comes over and he starts making fun of him. He says, "That's not much of a wall. Look, I can jump right over that wall." And he jumps over the wall, and Romulus jumps up and he strikes his brother and kills him, because no one will invade the sanctity of the walls of my city. And we look at that and we say, ooh, that's not very nice. But the Romans looked at that and they said, that's what we are. We protect the sanctity of our city, and no one will come against us. Now, when we think walls and cities, don't have in mind that we've got these big giant buildings at this point. This is just the founding of the city. In fact, archaeologists have reconstructed what they believe to have found in the very origins of the city, at one of the most holy places. This little tiny hut, and what they found is the posts that went into the ground, or the holes where the posts would have sat. Indicating a fairly small, we would just call it a little village or just a few houses. But the city is going to grow from that, and it will become a great city. Now, the city of Rome is right along the Tiber River. It's a city that is eventually built on 7 hills. And so the 7 hills city, the Tiber River flows alongside, but that doesn't really give it much of a natural defense, and there really are no natural defenses. In fact, the defenses of the city of Rome are going to be the Romans themselves and the walls that they will build around the city. One thing the Tiber does have for it is that the Tiber is a navigable river. In fact, it's the only navigable river, the river that you can navigate, have boats and big vessels, barges and things go up and down it, which gives it access to the Mediterranean some 18-20 miles away. So now Romulus has built a city, and he begins to collect various people, mostly men looking for, maybe ruffians and people who are going to be part of a city, but they have no wives. And so he notices a similar, a nearby neighboring tribe, the Sabines, and his men go down and they kidnap some women to be their wives. Not a very good way to, no courtship or anything like that, but eventually the Sabines are going to unify with the Romans, and there will be an extension of Roman citizenship to this nearby community. They'll become Romans as well, which will give them, these neighbors have now become part of the Roman community, but now you have other neighbors that were on the other side of those neighbors, and you never know, your enemies might attack you. And so the Romans, they're going to engage in preemptive attacks, and they're going to attack their new neighbors lest they be attacked. And so Rome will, even though Rome is just a city, it will gradually increase its what's the word for it? It will increase its influence gradually throughout the entire peninsula. Now, Roman qualities. I want to talk a bit about that. The Romans valued discipline, the Roman, he's not flighty. He's very self-disciplined, and he's disciplined in his military bearing. The Romans also valued virtue. Now, when we say virtue, we think somebody who's fine and upstanding. Their word virtue, and they pronounce it pretty much the same way, virtus. Virtue was strength and manliness. We would talk about being macho, and that was their idea of virtue. And they also valued gravitas, that is weightiness. In other words, they weren't like the Greeks who were sort of flighty and happy and joy. The Romans instead were always on parade, and they had that sense about themselves, the gravitas of a Roman. So when we look at the Greeks versus the Romans, the Greeks admired, and you see it in their architecture, there's a certain delicacy about it. The Romans admired enduring strength. The Greeks, they valued agility. The Romans, by contrast, valued power. The Greeks valued beauty. It's seen in their art. The Romans, they wanted something big. Is it massive? Is it strong enough? The Greeks were impressed by style. The Romans were impressed by utility. Does it work? What does it do? Which brings us now to the birth of the Roman Republic. What does it do? You see, Rome had started off being under the king. The king had been Romulus, and there were, the son of Romulus and the grandson, and so that we have a whole succession of kings until finally we get to Tarquin the Proud, and Tarquin has a son by the name of Sextus, and he's the king of the Romans. And Sextus, and I don't know if Tarquin's there, and some other folks, Collatinus and some other folks, there's Brutus. They're out on a military campaign, but it's quiet. It's between battles, and they're discussing who has the most virtuous wife, who has the most wonderful wife, and they say, well, why don't we have a contest? We'll, there's nothing happening here. We'll go back home and we'll just check in on the various wives. And they go back to Rome and they look in on the wife of one man, and there's a party going on and she's just having a good old time. And they check the wife of another, and she's just sort of laying around the house not doing anything. And they come to the wife of Collatinus and his wife Lucretia. She's there. She's making clothes for her children and for her husband, very industrious, very disciplined, the perfect Roman wife. And so he has won the contest. But Sextus, after the contest is over and everyone's gone back to the battlefield, he can't get Lucretia out of his mind. And so he comes back and there's no nice way of saying this, he rapes her. And he takes the wife of Collatinus and forces himself upon her. And she sends, after he's left, she sends to him, and she tells him the story, and he says, well, that's okay, honey. You were innocent in this. And she says, well, no, but my honor has been defiled, and others might look at this and use it as an excuse to live immoral lives. And so she takes a knife, and she stabs herself, and she commits suicide. And Collatinus and the others are so grief-stricken, she has taken suicide in the face of this dishonor. And now Brutus, one of the ones there, and Brutus wasn't considered to be an especially loquacious, especially smart man. In fact, Brutus, the name means sort of a brute, sort of a dummy. But he's so angry, and he appeals to the people, and he says, that's what we get if we allow a king to rule over us, a tyrant to take advantage of us. We cannot allow that. And so Brutus appeals to the people, and they throw off Tarquin the Proud. And so Tarquin is banished from Rome, along with his son Sextus. And they're going to have a new form of government. And so Brutus is now elected to be not the new king, but the first consul. In fact, there'll eventually be two consuls, sort of a president. He's going to have just a temporary rulership, which will only be for a year. He'll be the first consul, and a plot is uncovered by the nobility to restore Tarquin to power, to restore Tarquin to be king again. And the plot is uncovered, and it's found that the two sons of Brutus are implicated. And Brutus calls them to account, and he calls for justice to be done, and his own sons are put to death. And so this now brings about the Republic, where there will be a division, a balance of power. On the one hand, we have the citizens. They are seen in the centuriate assembly. On the other hand, we have the patricians, which make up the Senate. These are the wealthy landowners. And then each of these will have a part in choosing not one president, but two presidents. We call them consuls, who will each reign for a period of 1 year, and then they will step down, and then other consuls will be chosen, so that no one has all the power, so that there will be a balance of power. And so you will have notice the Senate and the people, the Senate and the people of Rome.